Welcome to Becoming Archetype, where we explore the science and strategy of natural health optimization and performance so that you can achieve your ideal self. I am Dr. Ryan Sousley. Hey, welcome to the Becoming Archetype podcast. I'm Dr. Ryan Sousley, chiropractor, functional medicine practitioner, owner of Archetype Health with clinics in Coeur d'Alene and Post Falls, Idaho. I want to start today with something that I think a lot about, and it's this idea that most people in America spend more money staying sick than it would ever cost them to actually get well. Think about that for a second. We spend $4.5 trillion a year on healthcare in this country. That's more than any other nation on the face of the planet, more than Canada, more than Germany, more than the UK, by a super wide margin. And life expectancy in the United States has actually gone down for 10 consecutive years. Down. So we're spending more than we have ever spent in the history of this country on our health, and yet we are living shorter, sicker lives as a result. It's one of the most backward statistics that I've ever come across, and it should be making people furious. And I think the reason it doesn't is because most people have just accepted that this is the way that things are. This is just what getting older looks like. That chronic pain and medications and fatigue and all of the rest of it, it's just the deal. And it's not. And today I want to tell you why. And more importantly, I want to tell you what you can actually do about it. So here's the thing that I think most people fundamentally misunderstand about the healthcare system. And I want to be really clear. I'm not saying that the system is evil or that medical doctors are bad people. My mom's been an ICU nurse for over 45 years, and I have friends who are medical doctors and anesthesiologists and PTs. So, I think they're really good people in that system that are trying to help, but the system itself was not built to make you healthy. It was built to treat diagnosed conditions. And those are two totally different things. I mean, think about this. If you come into the emergency room with a broken leg, that system is exceptional. If you have a heart attack and you need immediate intervention, that system is going to save your life. That's exactly what emergency medicine was designed to do. And it does that brilliantly. In fact, there's no better place on planet Earth to be if you're going to have an emergency. But here's where it all falls apart. When you come in with chronic back pain that's been there for 6 years, when you come in with fatigue that no one can explain, when you come in with migraines that come back every week like clockwork, when you come in with blood pressure that keeps climbing despite all the medications you're taking, that system has one tool in the toolbox, and that tool is management. You show up with a system, they give it a name, they give you something to manage it. A drug, a procedure, an injection. The symptom quiets down for a while and then it comes back. And then you go back and the cycle just keeps going. And I want you to understand something. This is not a failure of effort on your part. It's not a failure of your doctor's effort either. In most cases, it's a failure of the framework, because the framework never asks the most important question, which is why. Not what is the symptom, not what can we give you to manage it, but why? Why is your blood pressure high? Why does the pain keep coming back? Why is the body producing this symptom despite everything that you've already done? And until someone asks that question and actually goes looking for the answer, the management just continues year after year, bill after bill, and the underlying problem just keeps getting worse. So I want to talk about where that answer actually lives, because in my 15 years of clinical practice, working with thousands of patients, I found that the root cause of most chronic health problems comes down to one or more of these four things. And here's what's interesting. Most people with a chronic condition have at least two or three of these happening at the same time. And they've never had a single one of them properly evaluated, let alone multiple if they have them. So the first one, and I always start here, is the structure of the body, specifically the spine and nervous system. Now, I know some people hear that and they think, well, okay, here comes the chiropractor to talk about the back. But stay with me for a second, because this goes way beyond just back pain. Your nervous system is the master control system of your entire body. Your brain controls everything. And that's not a chiropractic theory or philosophy or opinion. That's just anatomy. Your brain controls your heart rate, your blood pressure, digestion, hormones, your immune system, metabolism. I mean, everything. And it does that by sending signals down your spinal cord and out through the nerves that exit between every single vertebrae in your spine. And those nerves branch out like wires in a building, and they go to every organ, every gland, every system in your body. And again, that's not chiropractic. That's just anatomy 101. But think about this. If the wiring in your house was compromised, if there was a short somewhere, if a wire was kinked or pinched, what happens to the appliances on the other end of the wire? Well, they don't work right. They flicker, they underperform, they actually break down. Well, that's exactly what happens when your spine shifts out of alignment, which we call spinal subluxation. And it doesn't have to be a dramatic injury. This is the misconception that a lot of people have. It can happen from years of sitting, from an old car accident that you thought you healed from or got away with, from looking down at your phone all day, from a sports injury when you were maybe 17 years old that never got properly corrected. Well, these misalignments put mechanical pressure on the nerves, and then that pressure degrades or interferes with the signal trying to go from your brain to your body. And when that signal degrades, the organ on the other end of that nerve doesn't function at its best. And that can show up as pain, but it can also show up as high blood pressure or hormonal issues or gut dysfunction or chronic fatigue. And so that's why when someone comes into my clinic for back pain and they leave having also resolved their migraines or their blood pressure improved, it's not magic. It's just anatomy, because you fix the wiring and the things downstream start to work better as well. And this is why the structural evaluation is always where I start with people. It's not because everything is a spine problem, but it is because if the nervous system is under stress, nothing else that you do is going to work as well as it should, right? I mean, you can eat perfectly, you can take all the right supplements, you can do all the right things. And if the system that controls all of those functions is compromised, you're going to be fighting an uphill battle. Okay, the second piece is nutrition, and specifically nutritional deficiencies, which are vastly more common and more consequential than most people actually realize. So here's a good example, vitamin B12. B12 is required to maintain something called the myelin sheath, which is the protective insulation around your nerves. Again, the most important system in your body. So when you're deficient in B12, your nerves start to degrade. You get numbness and tingling, you get fatigue, you get brain fog, you get cognitive decline, and B12 deficiency is incredibly common, especially in people over 50, because your ability to absorb B12 from food actually declines with age. But here's where it gets really interesting. Some of the most commonly prescribed medications in America today directly deplete B12. Metformin, one of the most widely used diabetes drugs on the market today, depletes B12. So you've got someone taking a drug to manage their blood sugar, and that drug is actually making their nervous system health even worse, and nobody's connecting those dots. Same thing with statins and CoQ10. Your body requires CoQ10, which is an antioxidant, in every single cell. It's stored in the mitochondria, which are like the little engines that produce energy in all your cells. Well, statins directly suppress CoQ10 production. And your heart is a muscle. So you're taking a drug that's supposed to protect your heart and is depleting the nutrient your heart cells need to produce energy. And that's why so many people on statins deal with muscle soreness and fatigue, and it makes perfect physiological sense. But the point is, the drug managing one problem is often compounding another. And if nobody's ever looking for those deficiencies, nobody's ever going to find them, which unfortunately is the case with so many people. The third piece is what I call metabolic dysfunction. And this is the one that catches most people off guard, because it almost never shows up on a standard blood panel until it's already become a really big problem. And so here's what I mean. When your doctor runs an annual blood work and checks things like your blood sugar, They're running a fasting glucose, for example. Fasting glucose can look completely normal, can look totally fine, while your fasting insulin is already significantly elevated. And elevated fasting insulin means that your cells are already becoming resistant to insulin. So your body's already working harder than it should to manage your blood sugar, and that process, if it continues unchecked, leads to type 2 diabetes. But it also leads to chronic inflammation, which leads to weight gain that won't respond to diet and exercise. This is why so many people end up frustrated. It also leads to hormonal disruption. It leads to accelerated aging. And then here's the kicker. That process can go on for 10 to 15 years before your fasting glucose, the standard test they run on everybody's blood work every year, before your fasting glucose even looks abnormal. So you come in for your physical. Your doctor tells you your blood sugar looks great, and you walk out thinking you're fine. Meanwhile, your insulin has been elevated for a decade and nobody ever checked it. That's not early detection. That's missing the problem entirely. The tests that actually catch this early are fasting insulin, high sensitivity CRP, which measures systemic inflammation, and then homocysteine, which is an amino acid that, when it's elevated, is one of the strongest predictors of cardiovascular disease and neurological decline that we have available today. And these tests exist. They're not that expensive. They're just not standard. And that's the problem. And then the fourth piece, and I think this is the most underappreciated driver of chronic illness in America today, and it's toxic load. We live in a chemical environment that literally did not exist 50 years ago. Glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup, is found in the majority of non-organic foods produced in America. And it's been shown to disrupt things like gut bacteria. It also causes damage in your blood vessels. It impairs mineral absorption, and it suppresses immune function, which is why many countries around the world have actually banned it. I mean, completely. You can't even use it in some countries, and yet in America, we use it all the time, all over the place, still today. But it's not just glyphosate. There are endocrine disruptors in personal care products, in plastics, the lining of canned foods. There are heavy metals that accumulate in the body over time, and these things disrupt hormones, metabolism, nervous system function in ways that almost never get traced back to their original source because nobody's looking for them. And so I want to come back to the financial piece here for a second, because I think this is where it really gets concrete for people, right? You start messing with people's money, they start paying attention. When none of this gets evaluated, when nobody looks at the structural, the nutritional, the metabolic, the toxic, well, what happens? Well, you get management, and management compounds, and it gets expensive. The average person, for example, managing chronic low back pain in America today spends anywhere between $10,000 and $15,000 over 2 to 5 years on injections, on imaging, on specialists' visits, on physical therapy, and some of that stuff helps for a little while, but usually it doesn't hold. And the whole time, if the root cause is a structural one, which in a significant percentage of cases it is, but they've never had a proper structural evaluation done. Nobody's ever taken x-rays. Nobody's ever compared them to what normal looks like and then built a corrective plan around what they found. Here's another one. The average person managing type 2 diabetes spends over $16,000 a year, not to fix it, but just to manage it, to keep the numbers in range. And year after year, they do that for the rest of their life because nobody went upstream to find why the insulin signaling broke down in the first place. And then here's the thing that really gets me. The real cost of all of this isn't even financial. It's the quality of life. It's the round of golf that you had to stop playing 3 years ago because your back hurt too bad. It's the grandkids that you don't get to keep up with anymore because you're exhausted by early afternoon or you're in too much pain. It's, trips that you have been putting off or just canceled altogether. It's the slow, quiet acceptance that certain things that you used to do, you just don't do anymore. And that cost never shows up on a bill, but it's enormous. So I want to tell you about two patients because I think stories make this real in ways that science and statistics never can. So the first one is about a woman named Deborah. She was 57 years old when she first came in to our clinic, and she'd been dealing with chronic low back pain for 8 years. 8 years. And in that time, she'd been to her primary care doctor multiple times, obviously. She'd seen a pain specialist. She'd had 2 separate rounds of epidural steroid injections where they stick a needle into your spinal canal. She'd done physical therapy twice. She had an MRI done. She tried multiple different medications. I mean, she did everything. And when we finally sat down and we talked, and she told me she'd been, what she'd been through, she added up all the copays and all the deductibles and all the out-of-pocket costs. And she was somewhere north of $12,000. So 8 years, 12 grand, she still had the pain. So we did a full evaluation. We took x-rays. What we found was significant structural damage or distortion in her lower back. The natural curve in her lower back from front to back that you're supposed to have, completely gone. And that loss of curve was creating chronic, unrelenting mechanical stress on the discs, the soft tissue, the nerve roots at the exact levels where, she was having the pain. Those nerves feed those muscles and then the structures in the lower back. And so, it was not complicated. Once we could see it, it was really clear. And it was the kind of structural finding that responds directly to corrective care, not to injections, not to isolated strengthening exercises, but spinal correction. And so spinal correction, is specific chiropractic adjustments, but it's also stabilization and strengthening exercises based on x-ray findings that go along with those adjustments so that the adjustments actually create structural change. So we put her on this plan. So then 3 months into the corrective plan, her pain was almost completely gone. And then 6 months in, she was out in her garden again. She was walking without dreading what the next morning was going to feel like. And she told me that, she had given a lot of those things up. She, just gradually stopped doing things over the previous, several years. And she hadn't even really realized how much she had stopped doing until she was able to do all of it again. And she said something to me that I think about all the time. She said, listen, I spent 12 grand in 8 years just managing this. And it cost me a fraction of that to actually figure out what was going on and then fix it. And, listen, that's the cost of never asking why. You got to ask why. Why is the problem happening? What's the root cause? How do we correct it? How do we work with the body's natural ability to heal itself, right? Okay, second patient is a guy named Terry, and he was in his 60s. He was on a statin for a few years, dealing with borderline high blood pressure, and he was just chronically exhausted. He was tired all the time. He had significant brain fog. Doctor had told him it was just part of getting older. He's like, Terry, you're just getting old. But his wife had been a patient of ours for quite a while, and she just kept insisting that he come in with her. And so he finally came in, and we did an evaluation. If you look at the neck from the side, you're supposed to have a curve from front to back, similar to the curve in your lower back that we talked about with Deborah. But when we looked at Terry's x-rays, he had what's called military neck, which means the curve in his neck was almost completely gone, almost perfectly straight on the x-ray. And, I talked about this a little bit earlier, but when you lose the curve in your neck, it puts a lot of mechanical stress on the nerve roots and the joints and the soft tissue in that area. And the nerves that come out of that upper and mid cervical area of the spine, those nerves go to your heart, and they regulate blood pressure, and they connect to the brainstem. So that finding alone was significant, I thought. But we also ran some functional markers that his primary care doctor never had. We checked his CoQ10 levels, which were critically low, which made complete sense given how long he'd been on a statin. We also looked at C-reactive protein, which was really, really high, which indicates chronic systemic inflammation. And then we also looked at fasting insulin, which was also high. In fact, his fasting glucose looked normal on every annual physical that he'd had for years, but nobody had ever ran a fasting insulin test. And his insulin told a completely different story. So we addressed both sides: corrective chiropractic care for his spine and the misalignments and the nerve irritation, But then we also put him on a functional health plan. We got him taking CoQ10. We put him on an anti-inflammatory diet. We started addressing the insulin resistance through nutrition and lifestyle modification. And 4 months later, his energy was radically different. His primary care doctor reduced his blood pressure medication. 6 months later, working with his cardiologist, he came off the statin entirely. And it's because his lipid panel had normalized once the underlying inflammation that was driving the cholesterol elevation, once that was completely gone. And so he told me his annual prescription costs alone had been up to $4,000. So because we got his body working better and we got his body to heal itself, just by finding the cause, removing the interference, giving his body what it needed to actually thrive and be healthy, he's able to get rid of all of those unnecessary bills and get his health back and get his life back. And that's the thing. Like, so many people are just spending through the nose and they're not getting their health back. They're just paying a lot of money to stay sick. So these are two different people, two different presentations, but the same underlying reality. Nobody had ever asked the question, why? And once someone did, and then actually went about correcting what they found, the management became unnecessary at that point. So let me bring this all together for you, give you some practical things that you can actually do. First thing is start asking why. If you're managing a chronic health problem, any problem, and all you've ever been given is a diagnosis and something to manage it, well, you have not been given an answer. You've been given a label and a management tool, and those are not the same thing. So start asking your provider, why? What is causing this? And if they can't answer that or help you answer it, you need to find someone who can. Second, get your structure evaluated. If you've never had a full structural evaluation of your spine and your nervous system with imaging, that's step 1, not step 3. Not something you do after you've tried everything else or only if you have back pain. It's step 1, because the nervous system runs everything and it runs through your spine, right? And so if that system is under mechanical stress, everything downstream is going to be compromised regardless of whatever else you're doing. It's like having crossed wires in your house and then wondering why the appliances don't work right, even though you keep upgrading them and having the maintenance guy come out. You got to fix the wiring first. Otherwise, nothing else you do is going to make sense. Okay, number 3, make sure the right labs are being run every year. Or if you have a problem, fasting insulin alongside fasting glucose, not just fasting glucose alone. Another one is high sensitivity CRP, homocysteine, B12, methylmalonic acid, and run these together because, for example, methylmalonic acid is a much more sensitive marker of functional B12 deficiency versus just running B12 alone. Vitamin D, that's another one. So many people think they're fine because they go outside. And yet, even when I lived in Southern Florida, we tested people and the majority of people were deficient in vitamin D, even in Florida, because we're inside so much. And the thing is that these are not exotic, expensive tests. These are not, inaccessible. You just have to ask for them because they're not routine. But they do catch problems years and sometimes even decades before they show up on, what would be considered a standard panel. And then number 4 is if you're on any long-term medications, do your research, look up what they deplete or ask your provider. But like I said, statins deplete CoQ10, metformin depletes B12, PPIs, like proton pump inhibitors, they, what you take for acid reflux, they deplete magnesium. So if you're on these things long-term and nobody's ever talked to you about repletion, that's a gap worth closing. And then the last thing I'll say is this: the most expensive healthcare decision that you can make is to wait. I see this in my clinic all the time. People who've been managing something for 5, 8, 10 years, who then come in and then we find a structural problem that's been building the whole time. And then they ask me, well, why didn't anyone find this sooner? And the answer is always the same: because nobody looked. And the longer you wait, the more the problem compounds, the worse it gets. It's like a cavity in your tooth or unpaid debt. That degeneration just progresses and gets worse. The nerve damage accumulates. The secondary conditions develop. And then the costs, and the quality of life, those go up and down, respectively as well. So the point is just don't wait, don't wait. You get one life, you get one body, you got to take care of it. Hey, if any of this resonated with you today and you're in the North Idaho area and you want to actually experience what root cause healthcare looks like, come pay us a visit. We've got clinics in Coeur d'Alene and Post Falls. There's a link in the description to our website and our office. You can check us out that way. And then if you know someone who's been stuck in the management cycle for years, go ahead and share this episode with them. You never know. It might just be the most useful thing you do for them this week. I'll talk to you next week.